Well, hi everybody, Father Alex here. Welcome to another episode of the Godcast. My guest this week on the Godcast is the very Reverend Dr. David Monteith, and David is the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. I do hope you enjoy it. If you do, then do check out the Godcast and perhaps subscribe to the YouTube channel where you will find hundreds of interviews with people from the church, from celebrity, from music, from politics, from sport, pretty much something for everybody. But for now, I do very much hope you enjoy this interview now with David Monteith. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is the very Reverend Dr. David Monteith, and David is the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral. David, it's wonderful to get you on. How are you?
It's great to see you, Alex. I'm good, thank you. I've got a Christmas market outside my window here, so Frosty the Snowman is getting, quite tiresome, I'd say.
Well, that reminds of my retail days working for Argos, David, where the music used to go on in September. You know, I wish it could be Christmas every day,
Yeah,
just as
yeah.
the kids have gone back to school. But
Yeah, yeah. I'm forming an interesting relationship with Celine Dion at the moment.
well, maybe, maybe less said about that, the better. David, let's. I mean, people will be keen to know about life at Canterbury, but I'd like to go uh, back, if we could, to the early days of your life growing up in Enniskillen. I've been to Ireland a few times. I was in Derry a few months ago, and I've become really quite fond of the country. Just tell us a bit about your early days growing up there and what was going on around you and in your surroundings.
Sure. So I was born in 1968, which meant that the 1970s and 80s were my time of growing up in Enniskillen. Enniskillen is 100 miles west of Belfast. It borders the counties of Donegal, Sligo, Cavan. Some people there would say I grew up in the Wild West. It's a very rural community, very beautiful. Lough Erne is absolutely gorgeous. We get a lot of rain from the Atlantic as well. And of course, grew up during what most people call the Troubles. And because it was a border county, inevitably there was quite a lot of terrorist activity of different kinds going backwards and forwards across the border. And so that whole business of growing up in a violent context, one which was, notionally a division between Catholics and Protestants, but really was a political divide between Republicans and Unionists, and into a tit for tat series of violence. So I was, when you're a little kid, it's just your life. You don't really realize that life could be any different. But as you become a teenager, you begin to think, oh, is this really normal? What's going on here? Is it really normal that I drive in the car with my dad as he's taking me to some school activity and we get stopped by the police just
Mhm.
down the road? Is that
Mhm.
normal? So it had a big impact on me. And later, when I went off to university, the Enniskillen bombing took place. And of course, I knew various people who were injured or who died in that bombing, which happened on Remembrance Sunday, including famously Mary Wilson, who was a nurse. She'd gone to school in Enniskillen like I had, knew her family. And Gordon, her father, publicly forgave the IRA for killing his daughter, which was a momentous moment, really. And he spoke very vividly about that and about how that was connected to his Christian faith as well. That in trying to follow the life of Jesus, he felt he was compelled to forgive, even though as a human being, as it were, he didn't really want to do that. But he knew if he didn't do that, he would get stuck in a cycle which would mean that violence would become much more part of his own life, never mind that, the
Mm.
experience of his daughter.
How did that help or hinder you as a young Christian?
Well, I mean, later on, it probably was the thing that made me eventually decide that I wanted to explore a vocation, definitely to the priesthood, and because I think in Gordon's actions, I began to see, which is something which is not always that easy to see, which is that Christian faith and religion in more general terms could be part of the solution of the world, not simply part of the problem. And that opened my eyes to all of that. And I think it has shaped me in profound ways because I find myself often serving in churches and in contexts where yeah, I'm immersed in a Christian community, but I'm also kind of definitely in the public. I've been shaped by a faith which really understands the public square and the difference that the teachings of Jesus could make to the life of everybody, not simply just to the life of those who identify themselves as Christians.
Yeah. Did you have friends who were Roman Catholics?
I did,
Yeah.
yeah. I grew up in a smaller town just outside Enniskillen called Irvinstown, and that was a predominantly Catholic town. So actually, a lot of the kids around the town who I would have known were Catholics. I was involved in the local public youth club, which had Catholics and Protestants in it. Even though I went to Protestant schools, because that's one of the big divides, which is still there in Ulster today. You tend to either go to a Catholic or a Protestant school, although there are now integrated schools as well. So I did have Roman Catholic friends, and but there was always a degree of suspicion about all of that. My parents, who were very supportive of me and so on, there was always a slight edge as to, are you really hanging around with the right people? That sort of, the teenage question that parents ask themselves. And it probably had a hue about whether they were Catholics or Protestants.
Yeah. And how did that evolve, David? How did that early discovery of faith and what was going on around you, how did that move you, shape you, and move you to this sense of being called by God to something slightly different to the norm?
Yeah, well, gosh, it's quite hard to articulate how that's happened, but I suppose I, I often, the longer I kind of live and serve as a priest, the kind of more ways I see how that early beginnings of life have shaped me,
Mm,
have shaped my faith and my imagination, and also shaped the way that I am a priest as well. And I grew up in the Church of Ireland and in a church-going family, um, and um, clergy, particularly in Ireland, they have a very keen sense of the pastoral care of their people. And, so clergy still visit. There's a huge expectation that if somebody went into hospital, the local rector would turn up and all the rest of it. The sort of probably the way church was here in England maybe 50 years ago or something like that. But I still bring a sense of that with me today. I can't honestly say, as the Dean of Canterbury, that I managed to go and see everybody who I really should go and see. I don't want to claim that at all. But I think I do look at both the explicit ministry within the church and the work within the community largely through a pastoral set of eyes.
yeah, that's nice to hear. That's how I think about things, and I think, I suppose, no matter how big it gets in the bigger realm, I always think about that calling to be a deacon, that calling to serve and to be around people. So it's really lovely to hear that. Of course, David. Sorry, you were going to say?
I was just going to say that I think another thing that happened is those intentional moments when different bits of that community came together in different ways,
Mm,
and the opportunities that I had as a teenager to encounter the other and to recognize what a difference that made. As a teenager, I went off to America for 3 or 4 weeks one summer on one of these schemes that brought together, me and a Catholic lad from Belfast went off and lived in the Midwest in America with a family for a month. And that just those very kind of visceral, face-to-face, real human encounters were all part of broadening my horizons as
mm,
to what it meant to be a human being, what it meant to love your neighbor, what it meant to live in difference with other people, which I think has been quite important to me as I've served in the church.
Yeah, David, I've not written this question down, but it's just come in my mind. Does it make what happened back then, in hindsight, more um, difficult to understand, or are you more sympathetic to what was going on during the Troubles?
No, I think I'm more and more sympathetic, actually, and particularly as I've learned how to read and analyze and understand things in ever more complex ways. So, for example, one of the big things that sat behind the Troubles was issues to do with poverty and embedded issues to do with social injustice. Housing policies, which very actively, although the policy itself never said, discriminate positively for Catholics or negatively for Catholics and positively for Protestants. But actually, when you read between the lines of the policy and you began to think, well, how would this work out in real life? It was, of course, a policy that was completely shaped by a particular worldview that was not about creating an even platform.
No.
So it's taken me probably a while, quite a long time to understand more and more dimensions of what sits behind conflict. Um, you know, a whole bunch of unemployed young people, particularly young men, with little hope in their hearts. Is it any surprise they got up to mischief? Well, not really. It had a particular character in Ireland with devastating consequences, but it's not unlike similar things I've seen in the urban context I've worked in England.
Yeah. And back then, David, the idea of being the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral, I guess wasn't even in the ether. You know, what brought you to the mainland? Was it university and a desire to broaden your horizons?
So it was university and that sense of discovering a bigger, badder world, really, I suppose. It was beginning to make friendships and relationships here in England. It was, I think there was a subconscious reason as well, which applies to me and a whole lot of people who went to school at that time and came to university in England or Scotland and maybe never went back. I think we came away because we felt we needed to get out of it, to go somewhere which wasn't configured in the way that Northern Ireland was configured. I think I also realized because I did wonder about priestly ministry in the Church of Ireland, but again, I think as I said earlier, because church ministry there is so hemmed in by you and your community, the particular people, the families who attend that particular church are your responsibility. Whereas one of the things I loved about the Church of England was the sense of the cure of souls of the whole community.
Mm.
Whoever lived in the patch had a call on the local clergy and their services in various ways. And the local clergy had a concern, an interest in the local community in that way. So I was really drawn into that. And then the final thing was that I was beginning to discover I was gay and testing out with friends in Ireland and friends in England, you where was it going to be more possible to live a reasonable life? And it would have been very difficult to live an openly gay life, even in the Ulster of my early days. And it was a bit easier in England. Not that it's been particularly easy, but it was easier. And certainly, um, I met and discovered other clergy and lay leaders and so on in the Church of England who also identified in that way. So I began to see it was perhaps possible in a way it might have been very difficult in Ireland.
David, I normally allocate half an hour for a podcast, and I've got that many questions
Right.
evolving in my head. I think I could be here for a few hours, but obviously we don't have the time. But recognizing that you were a gay man and the fact that you have been ordained for a number of years, can you recall some of those challenges between your personal relationships and the church? Because we'll get on to LLF towards the end of the discussion,
Yeah.
but if you could say something about that.
No, all kinds of things like, a previous Lambeth conference when, an archbishop from another province in Africa, tried to undertake an exorcism to a significant LGBT plus person. At that stage, I was at St. Martin in the Fields, and bishops from the communion were coming in and out of the doors the whole time. I kind of felt suddenly I was in the kind of crux of all this happening, and it wasn't just something that was happening far away, but it was also kind of happening to me, and learning how to hold and judge all of those kind of conversations. And I remember being offered a job as a chaplain in university chaplain, and being quite open about my partner and saying that that we would love to live together, but he might not be there every day of the week or whatever. And then this news being shared with my appointment being shared with the local vicar, who was of a very conservative Christian character, and the bishop getting cold feet and withdrawing the offer from me. I mean, those are just two little examples of, and then I mean, I suppose the thing that happens all the time and still happens is the countless little things which go on, which are, I suppose, in the modern parlance, we talk about them as microaggressions in one way or other, which I know women speak about, and people of color speak about, and so on. And there's a lot of that has gone on over the years.
David, could you say something about the influence of St Martin's in the Field? I'm a parish priest in the depths of urban East Lancashire in Burnley, and people may have heard the name St Martin's of the Field, but may not be are familiar with its worship and what it brings. For my sins, I'm on General Synod and always call in at St Martin's in the Field when I'm down in Westminster. But just say how that shaped you and maybe gave you confidence and helped you flourish.
Yeah, it's a hugely important place to me. I still love it dearly. It's a big church right in the heart of London on Trafalgar Square, beside the National Gallery and South Africa House. It's commonly has been called the Church of the Ever Open Door. It was not always the case, but that name really became associated with it through the ministry of somebody called Dick Shepherd, who was a priest who came from a very aristocratic background, but he found himself being made vicar of St. Martin's at a time when soldiers were passing through central London in the First World War, and they'd nowhere to stay overnight. That one train would get into Charing Cross, and then they weren't able to get the boat train until the following morning. And so he began opening up the doors, and the soldiers started sleeping in the pews of the church. That began a long history of outreach to people in need, huge amounts of work with and alongside homeless people. There's a big centre in the crypt of the church, but also a church committed to beauty, to music, to the arts. A church that had an orchestra associated with it, the Academy of St Martin Fields. A church that also recognized that if it was going to thrive and survive, following the story of St. Martin, who gave away his cloak to a beggar, they asked the question, well, if you give away your cloak, what then do you have to continue to give away? So, in other words, they got into the business of making money as well as giving stuff away. And so they were one of the first churches to engage in using their premises commercially. So the cafe and the crypt, and things like the concert series all make money to make St. Martin's work. All of this, the sense that you hover between the life of the world and the life of the kingdom of heaven in a way. Um, um, and um, and and the sense of that image from scripture of the angels that jump up and that dance up and down the ladder with Jacob. There's a sense in which the communication and the journey, either going up towards heaven or come down to the depths of the earth. There's that real sense of that rhythm and practice in St. Martin the Fields. And I still take that with me. And I come to Canterbury, and one of my predecessors as the Dean of Canterbury was indeed Dick Shepherd, who went from St. Martin's via Westminster Abbey eventually back to Canterbury Cathedral. So sometimes I go sit in the cloisters and look at Dick's grave and have a chat with him, because I think he also at times found this place quite tricky
Mm.
in the way that I do at times.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's a really heartwarming account, David. Thank you. And so the move into cathedral life, David, was that, did you have the mind's eye on it for a while? Was it something that you found attractive, or you thought God was maybe calling you to this kind of ministry?
I did feel ever more nudged that way, I have to say. And I think the experience at St. Martin's made me aware that I thrived if I were in a place that had that kind of inside outside of the
Yeah,
church sort of experience. And the dean's role in particular, I think it gives me permission to have one foot in the world and one foot in the church. I think I used to think that when I was first ordained that that would be the case wherever I was. But of course, so many of us clergy find ourselves, we spend so much time having to run the church, even with really able support and voluntary leadership and so on, that there wasn't always enough time really available to do having one foot in the world as well. Whereas as the dean, I can do that legitimately because I'm meant to be a outward facing, forward facing kind of role, as well as taking care, being the chief pastor of a community. I recognize I need to belong somewhere. I'm not very good being a peripatetic person, so that wouldn't make me a good archdeacon or bishop or anything like that. I need to have a community in which I pray every day. And then from that secure base, feeling able to reach out and be a bit more adventurous and imaginative. And there's a creative side of me. I'm not actually that creative. I'm not a great artist or a great musician or anything like that, but I love creativity.
yeah. I can completely concur with that. I couldn't draw you a picture of anybody or anything, yeah, I love it when you get that kind of light bulb moment. You think, we need to have a go at that,
Yeah.
and without the fear of failure as well. I think is also important to say. David, I want to move on to Canterbury if that's all right. So here you are now as the Dean of Canterbury, and yeah, I'm sure it's full of challenges, and we'll cover a few of those in a moment. But what are the great joys of being where you are at this moment in time? What gives you the joy when your head hits the pillow at night?
So, I mean, it's an amazing place to be and to live. I live within the precincts, and on my worst days, you can't help but look up to the building itself. On a clear blue, frosty night, watching the star. I mean, it's just electric, and it never ceases to amaze me. And I keep discovering new things about the building. It feels immensely privileged to be in a place as well that has Christian roots back to the 6th century. And there's something very liberating about being part of a very ancient place because it kind of keeps your ego in check because you're just passing through. You're doing your little bit when you're here, and somebody else, God willing, will take it on when you leave. And there's something really good about that. I love starting to be a bit playful with the space. For example, when I arrived, I was very conscious of how high the ceilings were, how tall the choir and the nave were. And I was very conscious that a lot of worship and practice and things was happening at ground floor level. But I kind of wondered, what if we kept looking up? So I kind of found a way to install a kind of a winch up high in the roof, which allows me to attach things and hang them from the roof, which suddenly brings in some color or some interest. At the moment, it's Advent. We have got the most enormous star you could ever imagine, which our great carpenter guys have made. And, I don't know, I don't know, 10 meters high or something like that. It's epic. And so I love the sense of the scale of all of that. I love working here because whilst I might bring a bit of experience or a bit of expertise in one thing or another, I am surrounded by incredibly able people. The world-class stained glass restorers, the masons who have crafted their skills over a huge period of time, our gardeners who, just wax lyrical about the
Mm.
bees and the bugs and us ever going more green. Not to mention the people who read spreadsheets better than I do. And there's something about being in a community where you allow the gifts and the strengths of those who are around you to shine. And my job really is to try and make that happen and then get out of their way.
David, that's so endearing. I I've interviewed Mark Oakley, who I'm sure you know very well, and what strikes me about both of you is your humility. And we've not met before. I'm just
Mm.
being honest, and your humility and that recognition that you are just kind of the guy who's got the name above the door, and the craftsman and the skills and the beauty comes through everybody else, and it's really lovely to hear. It's really very endearing. And talking of installations, David, you perhaps know where I'm going next. Is um, I've just returned from a sabbatical, but I kept an eye on things and saw you talked about microaggressions earlier in the discussion, but I saw some of the really very unpleasant abuse you and the cathedral got for the graffiti art installation of questions to Jesus. Just say a bit about that, David, about that whole strange period for you, I'm sure.
So one of my big concerns is kind of following the Dick Shepherd model is to try and make this place as open and as accessible as possible. One of my great joys, 3 years in, and just a couple of weeks ago, we managed to put a new temporary wooden ramp in so that wheelchairs have more access to that bit of the building. It's only taken me 3 years to do that, and it's temporary. But boy, was I happy because it whether it's a physical thing like that or whether it's kind of in the mind or in the heart or whatever, I'm trying to kind of make the space more available. And so we worked with a bunch of local young people, young adults, with a local poet who listened carefully to the kind of questions they would want to put to God. And then we sieved them all down. So we got an array of different kinds of questions. And then we thought about, well, how could we offer these questions and display them? And obviously, there's something very visceral and stark and hard, and indeed at times a bit ugly, sometimes a bit beautiful, but sometimes a bit ugly in the mode of graffiti. And the cathedral is absolutely covered in graffiti anyway, some of it dating back 1,000 years. So there's nothing new about graffiti in cathedrals. But of course, putting modern graffiti stickers on bits of this ancient cathedral seemed to touch a nerve in a pile of people who I think have, cathedral sits in the bit of their head which says static, stable, utterly beautiful, etc., etc. Whereas I think that is true of the best cathedrals, I think, but it's also true they're dynamic places of community. They're only here because they kept changing. And but the best thing about this was that I managed to annoy some people in America who are reaping havoc, in my view, in America. So, namely J.D. Vance and Elon Musk, who were very upset by this. So, I now can have on my tombstone, he annoyed J.D. Vance and Elon Musk. So, I must be doing something that offers some alternative vision of life, which I think is what we need and what Jesus offers.
Yeah. And I suppose you can accept the criticism of the art because one person's pleasure is another
Yeah,
person's disdain, isn't it?
yeah,
But there was some personal stuff in that. Did you do
yeah.
that all right? Or
Well, I mean, in one sense, I'm used to it. When I was Dean of Leicester before Canterbury, and I had to rebury King Richard III, which was another thing that wasn't on my kind of wish list for a life or a ministry. But you wouldn't believe the amount of anger and anguish over something like that, where suddenly I saw the Catholic Protestant thing suddenly emerge in a very visceral way. And I remember doing a sermon in one place I went to, and they put it up online. And by the time I got home, there was a Facebook page entitled Pray for the Imminent Death of the Dean of Leicester. And it already had thousands of people signed up to it. So, in one sense, I'm used to it. That's the life that some of us now sadly have to live. And I now don't read a lot of it. I get our comms team to read a lot of it because, you know, if you keep reading it, it does wear you down. And so, it's also true that sometimes people do cross the line, and when things like death threats or really serious kind of pieces of angst is thrown at you, then obviously we need to inform the authorities about that as well. So mostly I cope with it. After a very long, tiring day, when I've not had enough sleep and I've been trying to do too much, it does get under my skin.
Yeah. And something else that I assume gets under your skin is the in the wider churches, the LLF matter. Uh, I am a member of General Synod and I have sat through hours and hours and hours of discussion and debate and tears and everything else that you can possibly imagine around this subject, only for the bishops to kind of pull this almost unannounced. What was your response, and what is your response, David, as a senior cleric in the church?
So often, when those sort of debates are going on, often, whilst they always impact me, I've been pretty good at, have been times when it's got to me, but somehow this one really got to me, even though it's bizarre to try and think why, but I kind of knew that LLF was drawing a halt and getting into the buffers and wasn't that likely to come out of them very easily. So I kind of knew that intellectually. I think it was the emotional punch, and I used the analogy of being winded in the blog I wrote about this, um, because I think there was a number of things about it which I still find very difficult. Um, it was not cast as a pastoral piece of communication at all. It didn't resemble, I said in my blog that if I'd been a selection conference person for somebody exploring vocation to the priesthood and I'd asked them to write a letter, a pastoral letter in the light of this, if that had been the output from it, there's no way they would have been getting a recommendation to train for ministry. So I think there's some very fundamental things wrong in how the national church, whether it's the House of Bishops or the Synod or whatever, how things are communicated, because I think that matters, not just what it says, but how the things are said. I have no idea what will happen next. Some people are a bit optimistic that somehow this death will suddenly allow some kind of new thing to emerge, which will unstick it all. I'm not in a place where I can see that, but I'm glad there are other people who can see that. I think I'm trying to stick honestly with my sense of despair about it, to be quite honest, and to not move too quickly from the dark of it to the light of it. Um, and to begin to help me articulate and others articulate how how systemically this is a problem. It's not just about individuals. A very senior bishop said to me a few weeks ago, David, I just want to say sorry. And to which my response was, well, thank you for wanting to say sorry, but when it means something, come and tell me, because that's the bit of it I can't see at the moment, where it means anything, not just changes in practice about liturgy or anything like that, but the whole ecology of the church. I still go into rooms where I can feel and sense, either because says it explicitly or just in their whole body, that they really do not want me to be in the room and do not value my experience as a Christian person. And really, if you really press them hard, I would wonder whether they would even acknowledge me as a Christian. And certainly they would want to tell me that a life of love, which I've lived with the same person since I've been 21 and I'm now 57, that somehow that's meaningless to them, whereas I think that's meaningful.
Yeah, that is so eloquent, David. I'm sick to the back teeth of insincere apologies. And I look forward to leaving the General Synod because I don't want to be part of it any
Yeah.
longer than I need to be. But just let's finish on some more joyful matters, David. You've we're in Advent. Maybe you could just say a brief uh, word about what that means to you personally, and in the busyness of everything is, and this is probably good to hear to all clergy out there and other people who are working terribly hard at this time of year, what Advent means to you and how you find the solitude and prayerfulness in that. And then also, after in the new year, you've got the joy of the installation of the first female Archbishop of Canterbury. But I bet you are. I mean, it's like getting to the cup final, isn't it?
So let me deal with that second one first. So yeah, we're already in the planning phase, of course, for uh, Archbishop Sarah's installation, and we look forward to that. I hope it'll be a happy celebration. It's happening on the 25th of March, which is the feast of the Annunciation by the Archangel Gabriel to Mary, that she's to bear a son, and that's an announcement of good news. And I hope that that will really be the sense of that day. It's a day of good news and a day of the continuation of God's mission through Christ in his world, and particularly that bit of that, which is the Church of England and the Anglican family. She's the 106th, and we look forward to that. So it's going to be hard work. I've done big events before, and I know what goes on, good behavior and bad behavior, but I hope it'll be a joy. And Advent for me, like I suspect many, many clergy, is the best liturgical time of the year. I love it. I love its seriousness. I love its big themes, the confrontation with death and judgment, which I feel as if I need regularly in my life. And I love the music of it all, and the darkness and yet the promise of light. And I suppose the thing I love about it most is that it's primarily not about me, it's about God. It's about God coming towards me and us and our world. And all I'm asked to do is try to make ready for such a visitation. And, of course, that sometimes means a bit of, you know, hoovering of the house, as it were, or making things prepared. But I don't have to I don't have to create a spirituality of Advent. It's not that kind of thing.
Mm.
Instead, it's the opposite. It's get rid of all that lot. Instead, let God come towards me, and I constantly need that, and it's good news. So almost, I wish every day were Advent, and sometimes it's quite hard to get to Christmas, isn't it? Not only because of the busyness and all of that, but there is a certain there's a certain joy and comfort in Advent itself, and then you need to change gear all of a sudden as you confront a baby in our midst.
Wonderful. What a lovely way to end the podcast. David, it's I say this with my hand on my heart. It's been a real privilege listening to you speak and hearing some of your words of encouragement and wisdom. And I wish you a happy Advent and a blessed Christmas when it comes. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex. God bless.